Sometimes, the moment someone stops reacting to you hurts more than every insult they ever said. Have you ever noticed that arguments can keep a relationship alive, but indifference makes it feel like you no longer exist? Most people fear conflict, but very few realize that silence can be far more brutal. Because when someone argues with you, they are still emotionally involved. But indifference? Indifference often means your presence no longer creates emotion inside them. And human beings are not built to handle that easily. I am the Watcher, and here, in Shadow Insight, we observe the hidden mechanisms behind human behavior, emotional power, and the silent psychological dynamics most people never notice. Tonight, we are going to uncover why indifference creates a deeper wound than conflict, why the human mind reacts so strongly to emotional absence, and why some people unconsciously use indifference as a form of psychological control. Watch carefully, because by the end of this video, you may realize that the moments that damaged you the most were not the moments people attacked you, but the moments they acted as if you no longer mattered. And if this kind of psychological insight speaks to you, subscribe to Shadow Insight, because human nature always reveals itself eventually. At first, indifference rarely looks dangerous. There are no screams, no dramatic confrontation, no visible explosion. Just distance, shorter replies, delayed messages, a colder tone, less eye contact, less curiosity about your life. And strangely, this often hurts more than open conflict. Have you ever wondered why? Because arguments still create emotional movement. Two people arguing are still reacting to each other. They are still investing energy, still trying to defend themselves, still trying to be understood. Even anger can contain attachment. But indifference feels different. Indifference creates the terrifying impression that your emotions no longer have impact, and the human mind notices this immediately. Watch carefully how people behave after emotional disconnection begins. Some suddenly become overly nice. Others become anxious. Some start talking more, explaining more, trying harder to be noticed. Why? Because silence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is psychologically exhausting. The strange thing about people is, most can tolerate conflict better than emotional invisibility. A couple arguing every week may still feel emotionally connected, but the moment one partner becomes emotionally absent, the atmosphere changes completely. Now the other person no longer knows what is happening inside their mind, and that uncertainty becomes unbearable. You can even see this outside relationships. At work, being criticized often hurts less than being ignored completely. In friendships, cold distance often feels worse than disagreement. Even online, people sometimes prefer negative attention over no attention at all, because attention confirms existence. Indifference questions it. And this is where the psychological tension truly begins, because what hurts is not always rejection itself. Sometimes what destroys people emotionally is the feeling that they no longer emotionally exist in someone else's world. Why does the human mind react so intensely to indifference? Because indifference attacks something deeper than emotion. It attacks significance. Most people never realize that human beings are constantly searching for emotional confirmation, not just love, not just approval, confirmation that they matter psychologically to others. This begins very early in life. A child instinctively looks for reactions, attention, eye contact, recognition. Even negative reactions can feel safer than emotional absence, because the brain interprets emotional silence as uncertainty, and uncertainty often triggers fear. Jung believed that human beings are deeply afraid of abandonment, not only physically, but psychologically, and indifference activates that fear in a subtle way, not through violence, not through confrontation, but through emotional disappearance. The strange thing about people is, when someone insults you, your mind still understands the situation. There is tension, conflict, emotion. But indifference creates something much more destabilizing, a lack of emotional clarity. And the human brain hates emotional ambiguity. Have you ever noticed how people obsess more over unanswered messages than direct rejection? Because rejection gives closure. Indifference leaves the mind trapped inside unanswered questions. What changed? Did I do something wrong? Do they still care? Were they pretending the whole time? And slowly, the mind begins creating its own explanations. This is why indifference often creates obsession. Not because people necessarily love the other person more, but because emotional uncertainty keeps the psychological loop open. Freud once observed that the human mind compulsively returns to unresolved emotional tension. And indifference creates unresolved tension almost perfectly. No clear ending, no explanation, no emotional release, only silence. And silence forces people to confront something uncomfortable, the possibility that their emotional importance was never as strong as they believed. That realization can deeply wound the ego. Because beneath many human relationships, there is an invisible need most people rarely admit: the need to feel emotionally unforgettable. But here is the part most people avoid discussing. Indifference is not always passive. Sometimes it becomes power. Watch carefully what happens in human relationships the moment one person emotionally detaches first. The emotional balance immediately changes. The person who still cares becomes emotionally reactive. The other becomes emotionally difficult to reach. And suddenly, attention starts flowing in only one direction. This is why indifference can feel so psychologically overwhelming, because human beings instinctively value what feels emotionally unavailable. Nietzsche once observed that people often desire what resists them, and human nature still follows this pattern constantly. The strange thing about people is, the more emotionally distant someone becomes, the more attention they sometimes receive. Not always because they are special, but because emotional distance creates psychological tension, and tension creates fixation. This is where indifference quietly transforms into domination. Not physical domination, psychological domination. The person seeking emotional reassurance slowly loses control of their emotional state. They begin overanalyzing small details: a delayed reply, a cold expression, a change in tone. Everything suddenly feels meaningful. Meanwhile, the indifferent person often appears calm, untouchable, almost emotionally superior, and this illusion becomes incredibly powerful. Have you ever noticed how some people suddenly become more attractive after they stop caring? Most people think attraction is only about beauty, status, or confidence. But emotional scarcity also changes perception. Human beings often chase emotional validation more intensely when it becomes uncertain, and some people understand this instinctively. They withdraw attention deliberately. They become colder, more distant, harder to read, not because they lost feelings, but because emotional distance can create control. This happens in relationships, friendships, workplaces, even families. Sometimes indifference is not absence. Sometimes it is strategy. And the uncomfortable truth is, many people do not fear losing love. They fear losing emotional influence over someone else's mind. But now, a more uncomfortable question appears. What if the pain of indifference is not only about the other person? What if part of the suffering comes from the way we define our own emotional value? Have you ever noticed how quickly people begin doubting themselves once attention disappears? Suddenly, their confidence changes, their mood changes, their sense of worth changes, as if another person's emotional reaction had become proof of their existence. And this is where many people unknowingly lose themselves, because the human mind can become addicted to emotional validation without realizing it. Not only romantic validation, any validation, messages, attention, recognition, interest, reaction. The strange thing about people is, many only realize how dependent they became on someone's attention the moment that attention disappears. And then something dangerous begins. Instead of asking, why are they behaving this way? They begin asking, what is wrong with me? This is how indifference slowly transforms into self-erasure. The person starts performing emotionally, trying harder, talking more, explaining more, chasing reassurance. Not because they are weak, but because emotional absence activates a deep human fear, the fear of becoming psychologically invisible. Watch carefully how often people tolerate disrespect, simply to avoid emotional abandonment. Some stay in one-sided relationships for years, not because they are happy, but because occasional attention becomes enough to keep hope alive. And hope can emotionally imprison people more effectively than pain. Adler believed that human beings constantly seek significance inside social relationships. The problem is, when your sense of significance depends entirely on another person's attention, their indifference gains enormous power over your emotional state. This is why emotional maturity changes everything, because eventually you begin to understand something most people never fully realize. Someone's inability to emotionally value you is not always proof that you lack value. Sometimes it only reveals the limits of their emotional awareness. And sometimes, the moment someone becomes indifferent toward you is the moment you finally see how much of your identity was placed inside their hands. So, why does indifference hurt more than an argument? Because arguments still acknowledge emotional existence. Indifference does not. Conflict can create pain, but emotional absence creates something even more destabilizing: the feeling that your presence no longer emotionally matters. And the human mind struggles deeply with that feeling. Tonight, we uncovered something most people rarely admit. The real suffering often does not come from insults, rejection, or confrontation. It comes from emotional invisibility, from silence, distance, coldness, from realizing that someone who once reacted to you emotionally suddenly no longer does. But the deeper truth is even more uncomfortable. Indifference only gains complete power over you when your sense of value becomes dependent on another person's emotional attention. And this is why some people never fully recover from emotional distance, because they were not only attached to a person, they were attached to the feeling of being emotionally important to someone. Watch carefully. Human nature always reveals itself eventually. The people who constantly seek reactions from others often become prisoners of emotional validation, while those who understand their own value become far harder to emotionally control. And perhaps this is the hidden revelation behind all of this. Sometimes the most painful silence in your life is the silence that forces you to finally confront yourself. I am the Watcher, and this was Shadow Insight. If this video made you see human behavior differently, subscribe, like the video, and tell me in the comments, have you ever been hurt more by someone's indifference than by their anger? Because the answer may reveal more about human nature than most people are ready to admit. But then, what happens the moment someone realizes they no longer need your attention to feel valuable?